Okay, well, I think we can all agree that whenever I say I'm not going to do a thing, we can guarantee I'm going to turn around and do it again. Um, there have been some updates in the winter scandal, the Age of Scorpius scandal, I'm going to call it, because we need to be careful about names. I found out about this on Threads this week. And there have been, it just feels like there's been drama after drama on Threads this week. I've been there for Stickergate 2, I think we're on Stickergate 2, and a host of others in the book community. This has been something that I have been following more closely. This week, I said in the comments I wasn't going to come back to the Age of Scorpius winter drama and ongoing situation. And I think I've learned that I need to be careful about what I say I'm not going to do, because here I am once again doing a video on it. A book was back in the summer, an indie author released their book, The Age of Scorpius. They were then under the name Audra Winter, which is a pen name. And they had gained a huge following over the last sort of like 4 or 5 years. Been very excited to trying to promote their book. They'd gone viral very early on, and they had this book that they wanted to get out there. They had huge numbers of sales, pre-orders, that you would be envious of. And all this caused a lot of storm. A young person, 22 years old, very new to doing this kind of thing, I think. And the book came out in July. It very quickly received a great deal of negative reviews. The author's response to those negative reviews was not very good at all, very rude. They had shown signs of this in previous videos prior to publication, where they had responded to people saying that they needed to gain more experience by saying that they had done their 10,000 hours, and their 10,000 hours turned out to be starting from when they were 12, which I would say, and I agree with anyone who has said that that does not count as part of your 10,000 hours. That's 10,000 professional hours. Let's see, I'm on my second academic career and I'm 10 years into it, and I still don't feel like I've done 10,000 hours. So there's that side of the issue. The responses continue to be very negative. I will go into a little bit more of the detail there as we get into this. And what they had done was set up pre-orders and was then allegedly just sending out bookmarks rather than the actual book, because it took longer to get the book out than TikTok Shop allowed. So there was some complexity around that issue that has been raised by other people. There have been lots of reviews of the book, lots of very detailed breakdowns of the book. I highly recommend going and looking at Reads with Rachel, for example. Did a very comprehensive examination of the issue. Meredith Novico, especially, her work reaching out to the editors themselves, because there was at one point a complicated argument over whether or not Winter had actually got any editors in at all. It turned out that the story of Age of Scorpius is that it was originally published, self-published as a book when they were 14, and then moving forward, they didn't seem to have done anything in terms of editing the actual story or doing developmental edits, thinking about any kind of feedback that they'd ever received. I will come back to that as well. And the point where I came in was, if you go back and look at my original video, I am coming at this as a now 47-year-old who had a very large fantasy world, and still has very, very large fantasy world, that is called a paracosm, that it goes beyond something that you construct simply because you want to write a set of books or comics or whatever media you want to produce from it. This is something that you use as a method to process the world. It is not the same as maladaptive daydreaming. That is more of an activity, and is obviously, the use of the term maladaptive sort of suggests where we're going here, that it is not healthy. It can become extremely intrusive and overwhelming. And the difference with a paracosm is that it does have this kind of literary angle to it. The Bronte sisters, for example, probably the most famous and obvious example, had a paracosm, and they wrote about it, and they very often share information with other people outside of that world, other people talking to them and discussing it. I gave the example of one of the things about the paracosm that I have is that, universal free healthcare. Whenever I'm in A&E, and it happens more than it should, I'm a runner, so this sort of accidents happen. I will sit there and I will be learning stuff about, oh, this is how medicine works in this. How would this work if this was happening in Amnot? And that kind of helps me to deal with the world and to live with it, to come to understand it better. I had that angle, and I also had the angle of being autistic, potentially also ADHD. I could kind of talk about how very large and very overwhelming that world can become, especially if you have someone or a group of people, as Winter has or had, who were as excited and engaged with that world and really wanted to make it happen. But also the difficulties of how we present in the world as autistic, especially if we're very verbal, and because of the nature of human beings relying a lot on verbal communication as a fundamental quality of our species and our social relationships, autistic people, we are very specifically disabled in various ways around that. And I wanted to highlight how we can seem far less disabled than we actually are. The reason why I've come back to this is kind of complicated because I felt that the first video really said everything that I had to say, and I honestly am still feeling a little bit weird about the second video. I used it as a jumping off point for other aspects of looking at how drama spaces work, but I didn't really go into how toxic they can become and how damaging they are to both creators and audience and people associated with that when things go wrong. But also I was probably extending the limit, and I'm not sure what it was. And the reason why I'm coming back now is Winter has come back after a hiatus. And I do have things to say about what they have written. I'm going to try very specifically to stick to anything that is around the fallout that they experience, that they describe, what they've actually written. I'm kind of taking an academic stance here. I also had thoughts about the editorial side of it that I wanted to draw out a little bit more. And I think particularly the difficulty of being more disabled than you appear and functioning in the world as a young adult. I hope that this is going to be useful to outsiders who are autistic, ADHD, that kind of combination. I am trying to stay away from seeing this as, oh, this is the latest drama in the Winter Age of Scorpius situation, because I do just have concerns more generally about young people in the world as it is right now, and what you might do if this kind of thing happened to you at that age. But I'm also thinking about it from my own perspective as being an autistic person and wondering how on earth I would have dealt with this when it if it had happened to me. Self-publishing really wasn't a thing when I was writing in this kind of intense atmosphere. The social media didn't exist either. So we really are talking 2003 to 2005. It's a very, very long time ago. I have some thoughts, and some of those thoughts are actually related to my own situation right now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about cognitive inflexibility because it's something I've been thinking a lot about. I'm really using this as a jumping off point to anyone who has looked at this situation with Age of Scorpius and felt very frightened because they understand as an autistic person that they aren't reading the world correctly. And this is something that is very specific to being autistic, is the constant struggle to accurately read what's going on around you in the social world that is unspoken, where the rules keep changing and it feels very weird and you constantly need guidance and support, and that just doesn't exist. So I guess I should start with that bit. I apologise, this is very, very low effort and not really scripted. I originally came into this because Age of Scorpius' main character is a historian and actually an epigrapher, and papyrologist, and that's something that I actually do. That's what my research is. It was very weird to have that misrepresented in the first few pages of a book. That's just basically how I got interested. But the autism side is particularly interesting to me because I have followed a lot of people who produce autistic content, or they produce content that is around the research and the experience of being autistic. And it is much more focused on the sensory sensitivity side of being autistic and far less on the social communication style and ability to comprehend the world around you side of being autistic. I think that's because that latter one is much more difficult to really express and get people to understand, because I'm autistic. I know I also experience alexithymia and differences in my interoception, so I very often don't know what I'm feeling until months or years after. That means that in the moment, I often react in weird and unexpected ways to things. It has been a very long journey coming to understand what they call, they call it the 6-second rule. Honestly, 6 seconds is way too short. I need months to process things. And I think this is going to be my takeaway from this, is the 4 months that have been given is just way too short. Coming back after 4 months, I wouldn't have done that. My takeaway to anyone who goes through an internet problem is go away for more than 4 months. Give yourself at least a year before you come back and try and do anything. I'm going to have a look at what Winter has actually written, and I've been being very careful with pronouns and the language that I use here, because Winter has decided to come out as trans. I don't feel that I am in any way qualified to comment on it, except to say that if Winter wishes to be referred to as Milo, then that is something I'm quite happy to respect. And he published a piece of writing under the title High Disturbance. In that piece of writing, he doesn't actually specify preferred pronouns. However, at the very bottom of that piece of writing, Sorley, who is one of the art directors, I think one of the people involved in Age of Scorpius from the art side, has done a sort of like an art piece about it and refers to Milo with he, him pronouns. I'm going to try to respect that as being the choice that Milo has chosen, and that he prefers to be referred to as he, him. This was published on the website. There is a link to it on the Patreon, and it appeared this week. I found out about this through Inglorious Gigi on Threads, who's been following the situation and has given some commentary from the trans perspective. He is an author and you should go read his books. There's a long piece of writing that combines what I would call a traditional academic style with making links back to his mental state at the time of the fallout from the publication of the book, and everyone being extremely angry and about receiving a really bad book and not receiving a book at all. And there is some insight, I think, that can be gained around the issues with the editors, as well as the ongoing narrative about the one person, Lewis, who put out a video on TikTok and discussed it without naming Winter at all, or the book, and just discussing it. And that's going to kind of hopefully lead on to some discussion of cognitive inflexibility. When I read this, I had a combination of thoughts. I am reading this at the same time as I'm grading a whole bunch of papers, and I had felt like I was coming in and going, oh, now I'm grading a particular type of paper. It might be just cognitive inflexibility again. I was really, I'm troubled by this. My viewpoint on writing after an incident like this is that you need to leave a very long space of time between writing about how it impacted you, the center of the drama, and your own mental health. that has to be left out of the picture certainly in the early stages. If you are being interviewed by John Ronson 10 years down the line about your experiences of being part of something like this, I would say that's the point when you might be able to discuss the impact on your own mental health. I think at this stage it's still too early. I was really stunned when I read this to see this coming back 4 months later. What is it? So August, sorry, I'm now going to count. I'm going to count months off my fingers. August, we'll say July, August, September, October, November. So 5 months, midway through November. Bear in mind, as you get older, your perception of time shifts. And my perception of time is now that I seem to be having breakfast every 10 minutes and everything else is a blur. Might be because I'm teaching as well, and all I can think about is what I'm teaching and how many papers I have left to mark over the next few months and weeks. But I don't think it has been enough time to make everything about your own mental health. Now, there's a whole conversation to be had around apologies, and I discussed this in my very first video, and I believe my second video as well, and I highlighted Mika's rhetoric, who has analysed apologies and analyses drama more generally from a rhetorical standpoint, and the issues around when and how you should apologise effectively. And honestly, the perspective of being the person who is at the centre of it, who has caused the thing to happen effectively, is you should keep that back. That's no business of anybody's. The purpose is to express an understanding and a promise to do better, that you may have caused harm. People haven't got books, but relatively, given that we're just watching things fall out, we've just watched the whole Foodie Beauty crash out, plus whatever is going on with CoffeeZilla. I'm sorry, CoffeeZilla. It's Stephen Fideisin is the correct name. I'm so sorry. But the issues around there, huge legal debates going on that are far higher stakes than this. But still, the reaction, the treatment of other people, the way that Winter behaved was unpleasant. He was unpleasant to an awful lot of people, and the plan was unrealistic. The fact that the editors were thrown under the bus, which we're going to come back to, huge. Those are issues within a community that become very serious. And for that community, I respect people who will have felt hurt by Winter's responses to the things that they said, especially because so many people reviewed the book leading with kindness, and leading with a kindness that they perhaps would not have offered to anyone else. So I'm aware of that, and I don't want to say by saying it is not as high stakes as other things that have been going on recently, is not to dismiss people's feelings about it. So Winter has come back, and all of this piece is very much focused on using the wildfires that he has experienced from living in Colorado and other aspects of the destruction of the natural environment as a way to talk about his own psychological pain and struggle as a result of this. I found, from a writing perspective, a little bit overblown, but does reveal that actually he can write. He isn't incapable of writing. I have been in a writing group, and I will never forget the one comment from somebody who said, I write sentences like bullets. So I don't know how I'm supposed to respond to that, but it now lives rent free in my head. There is a sense of the academic side. You can see that on this page we have references, everything is cited, and there are whole sections that are entirely about the issue of conservation, preservation, indigenous cultures, the issues that are facing the national parks in the States. And I thought that was actually good. If I was marking this as a person who has to grade a lot of papers, I would be impressed with the level of citation. I would be impressed with the argument more generally in this particular paragraph, which starts off, though a warming climate contributes to fires with increased drought, and etc., etc. Yeah, good writing, objectively. And on from there, I felt like, I thought at this point that if Winter went off to Substack or Medium, I don't know if we're still using Medium, but Substack has horrendous issues. But, if you created a newsletter, Substack, and you just wrote about this, if all you wrote about was the issues of ecology specific to the national parks, there is a huge audience for that. I can imagine that if you removed yourself and your own emotional attachment to it, at least at first, and you focused on producing really well-rounded essays that dealt with maybe one particular issue per week, and you did research on it, you could build up a substantial following, both from the academic and non-academic world, and they would be really interested in what Winter has to say. And you could build a career out of doing that kind of thing. And very effective writing. I had no issues at that. What I do have issues with is the very, very serious references to a mental breakdown, which I think needs to be kept off the internet, regardless of whether it is in response to a drama which one is at the heart of or not. It's very frightening for people to read that you are having some kind of a severe breakdown where you may need support and not have access to it. The videos that Winter made around and after the initial responses veered between anger at people and also attempting to latch onto "this has caused me an emotional crisis." Your readers are not responsible for that, and the general public are not responsible for that. That is something that needs to be taken off the internet and dealt with by healthcare professionals, because it's frightening to see. It took me a really long time to learn this, as being in online spaces, but my first real engagement with the online world was via a bulletin board for AN and ED support, because I did have a very severe ED when I was in my teens and 20s, and the rules were so strict around discussion of weights and eating and food. We were there for recovery, and if you were in crisis, you were not allowed to post, and you were very strictly taken off by the moderators if you did post anything like that. And that, I feel, is a pretty good rule of thumb, is that if you are in crisis, you get off and you go elsewhere. This should not be the center of the conversation after what happened. And then actually describes the decision to go to Helsinki, Finland, which I felt when I first really got back into, I've been writing all my life as a child, and then I was like 24 years old, and someone really got into what I was describing and got me writing again. Yeah, I did a very similar thing. I was on one track, I was on rails, and then I jumped track very suddenly to what turned out to be a new set of rails. This seems to be a pattern if you are autistic, potentially with that combination of autistic ADHD, is that for months or years everything has to be exactly the same, and then suddenly it can't be like that at all anymore, and everything has to radically change. And I was in a personally very, very difficult situation and radically upended and changed my entire life, and decided to leave academia and move to a completely different city. Did not move continent, but did move city. So around about the same age, making the same kind of choices that if you are holistic, if you are not that particular autistic ADHD, look really just why from the outside. And that is the only way I can really explain it. And if you have anyone in your life who does this kind of thing, or you are that kind of person, you just have to know that it can be as mild as, I ate banana and yogurt every day for lunch for 6 months, and now I can't even look at a banana or yogurt, and I need to find something different, to this kind of extreme decision. I do want to highlight that this is the issue with drama and this kind of associated thing on the internet, is that as much as, you should not if you watch this video, you should not be going into his spaces, you should not be going into Sorley's spaces, you should not be talking to anyone who's directly involved with the project, you should not be digging up information on the dog, even though the dog is named in this, and I wish he hadn't done that. I wish he had kept that private. Mention the Kickstarter, but don't go any further. This should not be on here at all. It would be interesting reflection in, say, 5 to 10 years' time for those of us who are interested in digital society. It might be something I bring up in my teaching. I'm teaching on a course on digital society next semester. But I was really, I was concerned after the last video that I made that I didn't really discuss the difficulties for creators and other people who get caught up in this sort of event when it spirals so quickly and horribly. And there are people who take it too far, and there are people who have lingering axes to grind and who are quite happy to go into those spaces and make life absolute hell. And that is wrong and unfair. It chases people off the internet forever. As John Ronson's book Shamed highlighted, and that was something that I felt that I hadn't discussed in enough depth to just talk about the damage that can do. I'm uncomfortable with him putting this out on the internet for everyone to see, not just because it lasts forever, but just because it means that everybody gets to react to your mental health issue. I think that is something that you really need to step back and think very, very carefully about. Again, I'm struck by the lack of somebody who could kind of step into the situation and say, maybe you need to not talk about this online. You need to go away. You need to go and do something else. A similar issue with an autistic, I believe it's an autistic writer this week on Threads, who is much larger, very, very big creator who has done something not on the same scale as this, but there is an issue going on, and very much arguing that they are big enough that they will have a PR team, and why isn't somebody stepping in and making sure that they're protected, that the audience is, that the whole situation is carefully managed. So I don't know why Winter is attaching his own situation to the broader situation of the climate. I don't see a good enough argument for why. He says the world is burning and I will burn with it. We're not taking enough action for the climate. It must be done now. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I completely agree. I'm an environmentalist. I studied geography. We did an awful lot of environmental science at school. And I completely agree with that point, but this has nothing to do with his particular situation. That was about a book he'd written, and this frustrates me. I don't like people attaching their own personal stuff to much larger environmental issues. Just, it doesn't seem relevant. So he then just explains his name is now Milo. I believe there is a note to that. That is down the bottom, and this is where, so this, just to highlight, this is Sorley, who uses he him pronouns. That's still there's a lot of stuff going on here, and then we have 3. So that just, the note feels weird as well. So the note feels weird as well. You should open the source links. The environment is way more important than my gender identity. I just wanted to give you another talking point so I can bring attention to what matters to all of us. That is such a strange thing to do. I go back to set up a newsletter, make it all about ecology. Clearly he knows his stuff. Clearly he's done, I believe he's done a degree in ecology, or is working towards a degree in ecology, and make that the absolute focus of it. The odd jumps between the personal and the academic are very peculiar. I would have stayed away from that. It just feels very odd, a very odd choice that could so easily be interpreted in the worst possible way. And I know that this is going to make a lot of people angry. I am coming at this from a standpoint that is going to seem far more empathetic than anyone else would offer. I still don't think any of this is relevant. It's like two different, it is really like two different subjects being smashed together in a way that doesn't help either subject at all. I still feel like this should have been left from a personal angle for years. Even if at 22, 5 months feels like a long time, it really is not. Write a Substack, an anonymous Substack if you must, about ecology, about the landscape, about work, about everyday experiences, a journal, a diary. Make it writing, because the writing will bring in the audience that's relevant. A huge critique of Winter's TikTok presence was that it was all about the art, and it was all about Winter's own story as a person rather than sharing any of the actual writing, and that this is partly what caused the issue. Now, as part of this piece, he goes back over the issue with the editors. So we come back to the issue of the editors. And here I have another problem. What he's trying to do is to explain that he did have a developmental editor and he did have another editor on board. And since then, there have been issues around Reedsy commenting. Since then, there has been a tension with Reedsy. I believe Reedsy has agreed to reimburse some of the expenditure on those edits because they weren't considered to be good enough. I still feel like that is putting the burden of putting out a good book entirely on the developmental editor and the copy editor, and the timeline is appallingly bad. So, personal perspective again, I'm in the middle of writing, redrafting the Bone Moth, which I have spent a couple of years doing this now. So I had put out this thing that I put on Wattpad that was a first-person POV and is like an 8-part sort of first step towards writing something, and I just really wanted to get back into writing. Where Age of Scorpius must have been early January, probably, I've obviously got a full manuscript, but in terms of actual plot and development and work needed to get to a publishable standard, probably not that much further on from where I am with the Bone Moth as it is now. I should have my magnetic board behind me to demonstrate all the work that I'm doing on it. But at the same time as Winter was asking for pre-orders or advertising for pre-orders, he was getting these edits back, a developmental edit, a copy edit. These edits were coming in, and his justification for the book not being up to standard was that the edits, for some reason, he seems to think give him a pass to be publishable, and when clearly the book wasn't. And then on the other hand, he was already well past that. He was treating this as though this was a finished manuscript that was ready for publication, even before the developmental editor had apparently said, this is fine, this is ready. I am troubled because the other justification for the book being bad is that Winter was so busy with his pre-orders and ensuring that the pre-orders went well and getting all of that done that he didn't have time to do the final edits. And as slow as the traditional publishing world is, I do know from that they'd have all of that done by the time you came to do pre-orders. This feels like it was rushed because Winter has always had this dream of being a published author. I think that is why he published at 14. And I feel like it's difficult to know how to put this, actually. It's like when everyone around you, when you're young and you're young and you're disabled and you clearly have major issues, and which everyone could see, even if I didn't have the diagnosis at the time, everyone could see that I had huge issues. If I had stepped up and said, I want to self-publish this book that I've handwritten on pieces of paper in my 500-page, I had one of these things, I handwrote the first proto-Amnar type thing. If I had said I want to self-publish that, I could imagine somebody just going, oh yeah, it won't hurt to do that. Just the feeling of somebody desperately wanting a dream to come true and to be real, but failing to understand the need to slow down and take correct steps to make sure that the dream became the thing that you wanted it to be. I think for the people who were deeply empathetic to Winter at the time, the people who were frustrated and angry about the book but were still pulling their punches, I think many of those people seem to have been autistic ADHD people who were of the same sort of age, or had been autistic ADHD, same sort of age, with a paracosm, who had that dream, and you want to see it come true and you feel deeply sad because you can see yourself in them. And that is, where I came at this when I did my first video. So I can relate to wanting that, and I can sort of relate to wanting to rush to the end. I do actually really enjoy the writing itself, just disappearing into the writing even when I'm really, really tired, even if it's only 3 sentences and they're really rubbish sentences. I really enjoy doing that kind of thing. So I don't know if that's slightly different. So I don't feel that you can put this on editors not doing their job to as much a degree as Winter does in this piece. Now, clearly, if Reedsy has chosen to reimburse funds as a result of some investigation, that's another matter. But I feel like there's this bizarre disconnect in what Winter has written here between saying, I had editors and I effectively responded to the editors' comments and gave myself time to respond to those comments, because that's the key to creating an effective book. It does feel as though there's that disconnection there. Now, this goes back to Winter's discussion of his story, which has been pretty consistent since his first video addressing the controversy, which was that he had found a TikTok video that is talking about an unnamed author and an unnamed book that clearly wasn't edited and is indie, and he realized that this video was about him and about Age of Scorpius, and that this was the source of the drama, that this person was so huge that he was able to take a book that was otherwise going to do really well and absolutely destroyed it. All I can see from this is that the edits weren't properly being addressed and worked on in a time frame that meant they could be fully implemented before the book was actually published. And that lies with Winter. That absolutely solidly lies with Winter. He says, my developmental edits were returned to me in March before the pre-order chaos. My copy edits were returned to me in April in the heat of the pre-order chaos. You see, that's still too late. You should not be doing editing on a book with so many pre-orders and a launch date for July. That doesn't seem sensible at all. I would be losing my mind, especially if you were midway through studying and working at the same time. He goes on to say, during this time, I was constantly in shock, exhausted, and overwhelmed from a rapid business startup. And in the haze of implementing my copy editor's suggestions, I failed to notice that the edits themselves were insubstantial. In September 2025, Reedsy, the platform I hired both my developmental editor and copy editor through, initiated an investigation on the edit passes I'd received and requested third-party feedback from editors uninvolved in the project. I ended up receiving a full refund for my copy edit pass. Both Reedsy and the third-party editors agreed that the copy edits I received for the first edition of the Age of Scorpius were not up to par. The copy editor reached out to me during Reedsy's evaluation, kindly apologising and expressing her sympathy about the entire situation. I still feel as though much of this issue could have been avoided by ensuring that this was handled before a publication date was set, that no assumption was made that the book was in any way ready until it had been fully processed, that feedback had been dealt with, that it had seen beta readers, that it had seen ARCs, that all of this that it had gone through a substantial, not just having a single editor, copy editor, developmental editor look at it, but have other neutral people come and read it and say, here's an issue, there's an issue. And that's how you get to a good book, is it, it's never just one or two people. He then goes back to present some evidence around the difficulties faced by people who took things too far on the other side. And the particular word scammer, I have seen individuals sort of describe Winter as a serial scammer. Oh, he published it the first time, it was a serial scammer, never attempted to republish it. I don't think we should attach the word scammer to a child. I don't. Winter was 14 when the first book was published. I tend towards the idea that you should not attribute to malice anything that can adequately be explained by stupidity. And quite frankly, a lot of this is adequately explained by stupidity. That's rude enough by itself, isn't it? But yeah, there's a series of terrible choices. This is a series of terrible choices. Given all I've seen of the scammers and scammer space, I think this is somebody who desperately wanted a dream to come true and hadn't thought through all of the ramifications and tends towards making impulsive choices. And when those impulsive choices are happening in front of hundreds of thousands of millions of people, and that you get people commenting on all of that, because we all can, it's the internet, it's public, that is what creates chaos and problems, and we end up with this kind of situation. Very interesting from the perspective of studying digital society. Again, coming back to discussions of the very specific issues, the mental health, coming back to the very specific mental health issues described here. These are inappropriate for a public space. These are inappropriate for somebody who is only just on the outside of this, because this is still going to just inflame everything. Now, I find it fascinating because, having read a little bit of the Age of Scorpius, it's intriguing to me because clearly Winter can write when he tries, and this may well have gone through several revisions and thought. I have issues with the mental health side of the information, the other side, the background to the ecology. I think recognition that the book was really bad is good. Potentially, this could have been phrased better. Basically, I'm going to put it this way. So I think if I was advising on this, or if I was talking to this person, and if this was one of my students, I would say you want to frontline with remove any mental health content about your own experience of what you were going through. Stick entirely to brutal facts like, I made a clear mistake in setting a publication date that was far too soon. I should have revised the book and thought carefully about whether it was ready for publication prior to releasing it for pre-orders. I should have thoroughly investigated my legal position as regards sending people bookmarks instead of books, in what happens if I can't release a book on time and what the ramifications are for that. I would have been cautious about setting up an LLC. Now, they are fairly common. So I'm a freelancer myself, and I have a separate freelance HMRC thing that I have, that all of my income, if I get a payout from YouTube, then that goes into my tax return every year, or it will do next year. And that's a thing. I don't know what the law is in the States about whether you set up a business. I think going hard for an awful lot of imagery. So one thing about the art is that from the very first videos that Winter produced, the same art appears. So I think, although it seems like he has spent a hell of a lot on art, and clearly has, I mean, the website is astounding. I wish I had a website like that. Contact me when I have money. I could do with a website like that. I noticed that a lot of the art is repeated across all of the years of the videos. So the expenditure on art, it does seem realistic that if he is on a scholarship that allows you to just, if you're on a scholarship that allows you to just have an income and you are free to spend that in any way you want to, and it's just treated as a stipend and you don't have to spend it on academic things, then perfectly fine for him to spend it on authors, perfectly fine for him to spend it on artists. I mean, obviously it has been raised that he was getting artists from a board on Reddit called Starving Artists, I think, which I allegedly issues around looking for artists who are taking commissions at very low pay. Artists are living very fragile existences as it is, especially with the rise of AI. Now, here we come into making terrible choices. I am 3 cautionary tales in a trench coat at this point. So I know what it is like to deliberately overstimulate because I'm anxious and stressed, and it is a way of not looking at what I should be really looking at. For example, the last 3 or 4 months, my YouTube video blew up, which was, fantastic, also terrifying. And then I saw that as a way to share material publicly because I'm very interested in public engagement as an academic. And I hadn't had the confidence to do it before, and the video was a test, and I expected it to get 50 views and it got 30 something thousand. That was absolutely wonderful, and the comments were astounding. You were all absolutely amazing. I was also at the time interviewing for a lot of teaching posts, and I got them both, and am now dealing with far more grading than I was expecting to have and have not planned well, and that is pretty much typical and part of my disability. And part of my disability is not recognizing that I'm going to do that. I hate this for all of us who live with these kind of conditions, because when you are given, to kind of go back a little bit, actually, I also got technically support for my disability from work. So it was a government scheme here in the UK called Access to Work, and I got some things, and they're very good at giving you supports for when you are, they're very good at giving you supports for things like sensory overstimulation. So I have now got some headphones that are really good and I like them. I also have a couple of other bits and pieces that have been useful. I have an app that I'm learning to use that will also give me support, although it's taking me a while to use it. And that's great. What we don't get so much help with, and what really isn't supported to the same degree, because the support exists potentially, but it is very difficult to access because it is expensive, is support dealing with this kind of thing. So my only level of support that I got for planning overstimulation of the kind of you've signed up for too much and now you need to back off, and that kind of inability to really plan, to really see into the future and go, well, how am I going to feel in week 8 of term when I've got 73 papers to mark and I need to get them all done? And that's not even counting the other bunch of things that have come in that need to be marked and graded and sent back within a particular amount of time. Plus I have to keep teaching, plus I'm burned out from other things, menopausal, etc., because I'm not very good at that. I really need another human being to go, do you think that's a sensible idea? My partner is that person, and that is very often the person who does this for other people, will be an adult who is clued in to how you behave, what your particular issues are, and what decisions you are making in any particular moment. And unfortunately, my partner is also working an extremely stressful job, and he is often up at midnight working that job. So that creates an additional pressure. This is not uncommon for disabled people of every stripe. Being able to access things like personal assistance is incredibly difficult. This is the kind of support that steps in when you are autistic and you have to go to a social situation, but you don't understand the ramifications of statements of things and that you need help to understand them. This is not the same as saying that we give a free pass to people who say horrendous things on the internet and then turn around and go, I was autistic, or even worse, their parents or whatever come in and say, oh my God, you have to give him a free pass. He's very upset. He said something. He didn't mean to say that. I am perfectly capable of learning what is the right thing to say. It is infantilizing to say that there is no possibility for us to learn how to engage in a way that is safe, that is not demeaning to us, and to have that be effective and supportive. I guess the last bit that I want to talk about is around that issue of planning, because it's not just an issue of not really being able to plan or predict your future accurately. Hello. I don't know what I was going to say. I was going to say something. I was going to talk about planning. That was what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about cognitive. So since my cat has come to join us, and she also has thoughts and opinions, although those are mostly regarding treats. Hello. Yeah, so I guess the final thing referring to planning is about the issue of cognitive inflexibility, which is a very fundamental part of being autistic. It affects everything in ways that I am really only now coming to appreciate. So my inability to eat more than 6 foods is about not really being able to have many foods that I consider okay to eat for long periods, being unable to make choices have a very high cognitive load for me. That is another issue. Another way that it presents very specifically in high intensity emotional situations like this is the inability to know when to stop and the tendency to just go on and on and on. Now, I wish I was talking about me 20 years ago when I discuss this aspect and how it relates to my own particular experience of being autistic. But the way it has shown up very, very recently is my inability to stop and my tendency to add more things when I need to slow down. So this has happened to me in the last few months, as I was explaining about adding more teaching in order to bolster my income and to ensure that I can have a decent summer where I can do more research type work when I have less income. So I was trying to kind of figure all of that out, and then YouTube kind of happened, and it would be really nice to get to a point where AdSense can add that a little bit. And unfortunately, that meant that I was kind of negotiating with lots of different things happening at once, a bunch of new things. We're now operating on a new learning platform at my university, so I had suddenly have to learn a whole new platform for everything that I do, a whole new course which has a higher weekly cognitive load that's unusual. I have to admit that I'm starting to realize that I struggle more with textual communication than I previously thought. For some reason, when it's zero effort shit posting on Threads, fine, not a problem. We'll talk to people without that being an issue. Or at least I'm not as aware of the problem of sitting for ages and ages and ages and thinking of the precise wording that I need to use. I mean, it might be just so many years of experience with struggling with finding the right words that's been the problem. But that aspect of it and the constant discovery of new aspects of the adult world that I am too disabled to really cope with, that I didn't realize I was too disabled to cope with. I went into getting a diagnosis having done what I thought was an awful lot of research, and having also had people repeatedly tell me over the years, as understanding around autism and adult autism became better understood and the diagnostic criteria shifted, that I was autistic. And unfortunately, I knew about 5 to 10% of ways that I am disabled by being autistic. I know about 20 to 30% now. It still shows up in ways that are unexpected. I had grown up blocking it out. Some people use the term masking. I think of it as blocking out how I actually feel about things and what's going on around me and trying my hardest just to get through the day. That, I think, is a bigger issue than just something like this. So I am always learning more about the ways that I struggle in the world, especially when I am not at my best. So, yeah, this has been a learning experience. Now, where does this leave us with Milo Winter? And what can we learn from this? I think the first thing to do if this kind of thing happens to you is that you step back. I I think the biggest, most obvious takeaway for indie authors is to have the editing system, the developmental edits, and all of that done and in place, and loads of people having reassured you that your book is ready to go. Lots of, all of the trusted beta readers and ARC readers and editors have gone through it. And that they are the people who, the people that you trust, the people who are engaged with the work, but not at a fan level, who are able to tell you when things aren't good and need to be improved, and that you don't even start pre-orders until you've got that sorted out. I know that this sometimes happens in the traditional publishing world, that kind of thing will happen, but they have all of those people set in place with salaries. You need to do that all by yourself if you're an indie author. I think that's the most obvious thing. The next thing is that if this kind of thing goes wrong, you need to break away from the blaming one person. I do wonder if the narrative fixation on the one TikTok video having caused the spiral is to do with inflexibility and seeking to find an effective narrative that explains the situation. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, obviously. I think this is far too early to come back to this in this particular way. I'll definitely keep these intimate details of a complete mental breakdown off the internet. It's not appropriate. It needs to be dealt with by a professional. And it's the kind of thing that you could mention in 5 to 10 years, but not now, I don't think. I think it's too soon. And, don't use something like transitioning to try and claim that you're making a point about ecological restoration. My only comment on Milo's decision to transition is declaring it along with all of this. I noticed that in the artist statement, Winter is still expecting to have a book out by spring 2026. I still feel like that's too soon. I think, give yourself at least a year from now to work on it, to really get something that is good and worth reading, worth what everyone is waiting for. I think in terms of learning from the situation is being able to step back and get off the internet, just as Angelina Skov and I were thinking, oh, finally he has left the internet and will give us, present a bit of space, and I'm potentially digging back into it. But I was particularly interested in the idea of the planning and the discussion around when you should start the process of pre-orders and the nitty-gritty of some of the complicated things, and fitted into my own inability as an autistic person to properly plan and think through anything, as a lesson to myself right now, having to do an awful lot of planning for the next 3 to 4 weeks to make sure I get through this phase of the later part of the year. And that is all I have to say about that. If you got this far, thank you very much for watching. I apologise that this is such low effort content. I hope that it has been useful to all of those who have followed this because they saw a lot of themselves in Winter and were terrified about this same thing happening to them. It seems to me that most people in the indie publishing space are very careful and do an awful lot of work to make sure that their books are the best they can possibly be when they publish them, and don't make those kind of mistakes. On the personal side, it is extremely difficult when you are autistic to relate to the rest of the world, to understand what's going on and to understand yourself, because obviously alexithymia and interoception being different, proprioception often as well, all of these things play into a difficulty reading the world around you and the world that's inside you to any effective degree. This isn't to justify anything that winter has done. I want to absolutely highlight that. I am not on winter's side. I'm also not particularly against winter. I'm only seeking to understand what has gone on, and it's my primary interest in drama content has always been this strange tension between the identities that we hold of ourselves and the way that that is reflected back to us, or often not reflected back to us. So I only hope that everyone who is struggling at the moment with the last few months of the year are doing okay, or as okay as they can be. And thank you very much for watching. If you got this far, thank you very much indeed for watching, and thank you very much to all the support from my Patreons. Thank you very much to my patrons, Gil the Gilded Dragon, Cameron Desar, Karen Kunda, Hey Shannon, Jane Kay, Jane Steele, Marley Marker, Joe, and Rosie. Thank you very much to my cat for coming to join us. Come on. There we are. To say goodbye to the audience. You want to say goodbye? No, you don't want to say goodbye. I want to say, can I have some tuna, mummy? So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next week for the next video.